the discussion some other way?
I suggest
That's
we start with your remarks and then continue accordingly.
Okay. So, Matjaz, as we discussed, it might be helpful for me to just lay out a bit of a perspective on the global development system and how it has been or is functioning or not to promote global goals of various kinds and
Just
development
a second,
priorities.
We lost your voice for a second. Yes, we hear you very well.
Can you hear me? Yeah, everything's fine? Okay.
Yes.
So let me start again then. So Matjaz, as we discussed, perhaps it would be useful for me just to make a few remarks on the global development system, so to speak, and how it has been functioning, system or non-system. That's one of the issues we can discuss, and how it has been functioning to promote shared global aims, or what are presumed to be shared global aims, including, of course, the eradication of poverty as one of them, and in the process to raise some questions about what kind of institutional reorganization or changes in norms and in legal frameworks and so on might be helpful. That was what I had in mind to do, if that sounds good good to you. Absolutely, yes, please. Okay, great. And I'll try to be brief so that we can have more discussion, which I think would be the best thing. So let me just say that, first of all, if a Martian were to be observing us, so to speak, and ask the question, is there really a great deal of international solidarity that is being observed on Earth? Are those with the capacity to address problems using that capacity? If we were to naively, or the Martian were to naively ask this question, but with benefit of all the information that is available to address this question, what answer would that being come up with? I know this is an awfully naive scenario which I'm painting, but what would that, what conclusion would that being arrive at? I think that in the first instance, this observer would conclude that there is a great imbalance between rhetoric and action. Now, I would be glad to be contradicted by you or any of the students, but I think this would be one of the conclusions that this observer would come to, a very great imbalance between rhetoric and action. And how would that imbalance be identified? Well, one of the ways in which it would be identified is simply that as part of the rhetoric, the agents concerned who are spouting the rhetoric are ostensibly committing themselves to various things. They're saying, we will do X, and we will do Y, and we believe in Z, or Z if you prefer that. Right. So the actors themselves are saying these things, and it is not observed that they are acting, at least collectively, and most of the time also not individually, in a way that conforms with these this rhetoric. Now, you and I, as human beings here on Earth, might be so inured to this. We may by now have become so accustomed to this situation that we do not find it interesting, so, or worthy of comment. But let me nevertheless recognize that the observer from Mars or from whichever place might well take this as one of the starting points of the description of the situation, right? And then we can later on, and that observer could later on decide whether this is noteworthy or not, or ultimately of importance or not. But certainly there appears to be such an imbalance. Second, if one looks at the actions which are undertaken, not only do they appear to be in a degree of shortfall from what's required, but they appear to be oftentimes in extreme shortfall from what is required. And one can think of many, many instances of this, climate action being an obvious one, where the existential nature of the threat, for many at least, and the clarity with which we have understood what was to be done for quite a long time, and the availability of certain actions that we could have undertaken, if only prudentially, makes it, I think, noteworthy that there's not only a gap, but a very, very considerable gap, right, between the actions being collectively undertaken and what is collectively presumed to be required, right? Even in cases where there is some degree of consensus or coalescence, a fair degree, as to what it is that is needed and to which the actors have committed themselves, nominally at least, right? A third observation might be that whatever actions are observed to be undertaken are not especially coordinated. There are instances where that is not the case. That is to say, where there is some coordination that's visible, right? I was reading the other day, and you may know much more about this, about the last country in the world formally to eradicate the use of leaded fuel, leaded gasoline. If I understood correctly, there has been a UN effort to do that, which countries have signed on to, and which has been quite successful, leading to in effect to every country in the world having formally abandoned it. This is a major achievement. So there are instances of this kind where one can find success, evident success. The Montreal Protocol, chlorofluorocarbons might be another example, being largely disused now. So there are instances, but there are also innumerable cases where we see either no effort at coordination, or we see some efforts and effective failures of coordination and cooperation. And that might also be noteworthy insofar as a number of these problems have the feature that they benefit from cooperation. And one can, of course, elaborate on that game theoretically, why it is that they benefit from cooperation. But in many of them are instances in which, to the extent that they are shared problems, anything that one actor does is to the benefit of other actors. There's a public good aspect which is present in relation to a number of these problems. And there's also very often an aspect, therefore, of strategic interaction in which some element of assurance that other actors are doing their part can also be helpful in encouraging an actor to do their own part. But these questions of implementation apart, the lack of evidence of coordinated solutions in a number of instances, even where there is some rhetoric in the direction of coordination and its necessity, is also, I think, evident. I would put it to you that the observer would be a little bit perplexed at this situation, especially, as I noted, because some of the threats are existential in nature, or seemingly so. Now, the observer might draw the conclusion that this species is quite myopic, unable to see what are the dire prospects which await it if it doesn't undertake certain kinds of actions, much as lemmings are. You know, human beings think about lemmings that way because of the idea of lemmings jumping off a cliff or running off a cliff unthinkingly, myopically. it may be that this observer would have this impression of us. The observer might also think that we're rather narrowly self-interested. And these may not be two entirely distinct thoughts, of course, because enlightened self-interest, which is to say a non-myopic view of where one's interest lies, one's individual interest lies, as opposed to the collective interest of the species or of humanity, might also lead us in many of these directions, as Smith, Tocqueville, and others emphasized in pointing to a concept of enlightened self-interest, an extended or more capacious understanding of where and what our individual where our individual interest lies, or what it is, might lead us to do things which are on the surface other regarding, but we do them also because we have a view of where our individual interest lies, which is and what it is, which is more far-seeing. So, in this respect, too, the observer might conclude there is evidence of a certain limitation on the part of the beings concerned. Now, maybe to some extent it can be understood, maybe to some considerable extent, in terms of a conflict or a competition over resources, which is, so to speak, rational. Just as ethologists, animal behavior specialists, and ecologists might look at different groups of a given species or different species in conflict with each other, and conclude that there is a rational element to that conflict, right? So some of our conflicts might be understood in that way, but nevertheless, as many analysts have pointed out, even amidst the rational element of conflict, there is also a rational demand for cooperation. Amartya Sen used the phrase cooperative conflict in reference to gender and the household, because of the idea that there is an inherently cooperative element in all of household life. Right? People come together to form families and households, or they remain in them, and they undertake certain kinds of activities cooperatively, if only by not disrupting them in certain ways, but most often by also doing quite a lot to promote the shared life of the family or the household. But that does not exclude there also being elements of conflict about who is to do the dishes, for example, or do the cooking, or whatever else. So there is cooperation and conflict, which is involved in many social situations. And the mere existence of some dimension of, so to speak, rational interest in regard to how we do as individuals or as a subgroup does not exclude at all the idea that there would also be a great deal of benefit from cooperation. So these are some very abstract and general thoughts, maybe put in a little bit of a naive way. But if we now go into a more detailed perspective on the global development system and how it is functioning or not functioning, applying these rather abstract points, I think we can say a lot more. Right? One of the words that I used at the outset was system. And then I immediately corrected myself and I asked the question, well, is it a system or is it a non-system? Right? And I think that this is something worth thinking about a little bit. I alluded to that also earlier, or just now, in talking about the lack of apparent cooperation with respect to many issues. The Bretton Woods system was widely understood as a system. Many of you, your students, may be familiar with this, but some may not. That is the system of exchange rates, which was put in place after the Second World War and persisted until the early 1970s, which was a so-called gold exchange system, where the countries that were members of this system, the vast majority of countries in the world, pegged their currency to the US dollar, which in turn pegged its currency to gold. Okay. And actually, I'm not sure if it was the vast majority. We'll need to go back and check that. There were certainly some countries that weren't members, but that's worth going into. At any rate, separately. But this was the gold exchange system, and it broke down in the early 1970s, giving rise to what we have now, which is predominantly a system of flexible exchange rates with individual countries choosing to peg their currency to another currency or to gold or to some basket of currencies, or not, allowing them to flexibly float and so on. And when this change happened, when the system broke down, there was a great deal of confusion as to what would emerge and prevail. And the Japanese finance minister at the time was said to have described the new situation which had emerged as a non-system. The system had been supplanted by a non-system. So this is a roundabout way of my introducing the phrase non-system, or giving it a little bit more of a historical reference. Do we have a system or do we have a non-system? Right? In the case of the Bretton Woods system, which broke down, there was a system which became a non-system. Here, have we ever had a system of development cooperation? No, I was a member of a committee, the independent team of advisors to the ECOSOC, which advised on the United Nations development system. And I was advised at an early stage that actually there was no such thing as a system, formally speaking. It had never been recognized in any document that had been adopted by countries. But it was a phrase which had begun to be used loosely and informally to describe the ensemble of UN organizations concerned with development and how it is that they function together. Okay. So it was really more of a non-system than a system, even within the UN context. But when one broadens from the UN context and asks the question, how do all the actors in development, the bilateral development agencies, the multilateral organizations, such as the international financial institutions and regional development banks, and many other specialized bodies concerned with particular topics and subjects, innumerable now, how do they function together, if they do at all? Right? Even when they're working on exactly the same thing or ostensibly doing something that's thematically very, very intimately related with one another's missions and concerns. What one finds, I think, most often is the lack of a clear structure or a hinge of any sort to bring these together. Now, one doesn't want to just add to calls for additional coordination. That's really not the point. But to understand that there is a cost to the lack of high-level leadership in regard to these matters, which might ensure that there is some shared purpose or shared focus. For me, one of the most marked examples of this is the perennial failure of the developed countries to achieve their ODA target of 0.7%, a target which of GNI, a target which originated in the call for the new international economic order in the 1970s, but which has been subsequently embraced by the so-called donor countries in various later documents and commitments that they have made. But not only do the commitments that are, not only are the commitments that have been made not honored, But in fact, there's quite a lot of backsliding, which has been observed in the case of a number of countries. And we have a very substantial gap with the actual average amount of ODA as a percentage of GNI being more on the order of 0.35, I think. I can't remember exactly, but it's might even be a bit less. It might be less than that. I checked this last week, but the average is less than half of the commitment on across OECD countries. So you have a low level of actual of living up to this commitment, and you actually have backsliding in a number of cases. You have creative accounting, which has increasingly been introduced, so that this number is actually deceptive. But you also have domestic concerns of various kinds taking precedence, especially in hard times, perhaps understandably to an extent. Equally seriously, you don't have any type of coordination about, or adequate coordination certainly, about fulfilling the ostensible priorities. So for instance, despite all the talk about eliminating poverty and deprivations, the proportion of ODA that goes toward basic social services remains trivial. Okay. With quite a lot of the ODA instead going to infrastructure projects and other kinds of expenditures, which may have knock-on effects of various kinds, but which certainly don't reflect directly the nature of the rhetoric adopted in the Millennium Development Goals and now in the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me say a word about those goals, and then I will end and turn it over to you for fuller, more multilateral discussion on the goals. I was never personally someone who believed that the adoption of global goals would be a game changer, salvific, something that would fundamentally shift the nature of the development discourse or the development enterprise. I suppose one reason for my own hesitation in that regard was that I had thought that politically, sociologically, there are powerful reasons to imagine that such a language could become more of a packaging than a fundamental axis of coordination or a basis on which to shift priorities and to motivate actions. I also felt, going into the logic as to how it is that these goals were supposed to enhance accountability or motivation, that logic was actually quite weak, something we can go back to in the discussion. So to the extent that these goals are useful, it may be because they provide a high-level umbrella for conceptualizing what are the ends of global development, but I do not believe personally that they have had a transformative effect, or could be reasonably expected to have had a transformative effect on development actions, priorities, and programs on the ground. And indeed, we see that insofar as it is possible to keep a scorecard, the UN does keep a scorecard of success and failure in relation to the development goals as we move toward 2030, that there is a very mixed picture indeed, shall we say. And that was true also for the MDGs. Much as the MDGs, which preceded the SDGs, are presented as a success, the picture was in fact very mixed, even according to the official reports on MDG attainment. And one of the areas in which one can see this is the first SDG on the elimination of extreme poverty. I believe that you have seen a paper which I have recently produced, though I think you might have seen a preprint draft of that, which might have had certain flaws in it. But in that draft, I try to look at the question of how likely it is that extreme poverty will indeed be eliminated by 2030. And I point out that whereas elimination is a worthy goal and certainly has considerable rhetorical power to it as an idea, it was probably never a fully realistic goal in this time scale. But certainly if one interprets extreme poverty in certain ways that are more expansive as to one's understanding of what would be needed to eliminate extreme poverty, it's very unlikely that it will be eliminated. And even according to the more stringent understandings, it is not going to be wholly eliminated. And of course, the pandemic has made that still less likely. If we ask the question, what is it that would ensure that it would be eliminated, or raise the likelihood at any rate, that extreme poverty would be eliminated? I think the answer is a robust framework for growth and development globally, which in particular reaches the regions of the world which have the largest proportion of the extreme poor. That regional distribution changes depending on what poverty lines or poverty identification criteria one uses. So it's not straightforward to say where the poor would be under all of the scenarios, but certainly Sub-Saharan Africa would be one of them. And South Asia would likely also continue to be one of them. And Latin America would also be one of them. So one needs a framework globally that is oriented toward growth and development, and preferably an inclusive form thereof. Right? To what extent do on-the-ground development projects which aim to provide services to people or to directly reach them or to connect them to infrastructure and so on play a role? Certainly, they have their role to play, right? But one needs to have a multi-level view of the problem and very much think about the global actions which have to be undertaken in order to create a pro-growth environment, right? And I think that if we are asking the question, and of course I have in mind here, as we all should today, green growth to the extent possible. If we ask the question, to what extent is there really high-level coordination and attention to the needs of developing a pro-growth environment, and in particular, a pro-inclusive growth environment and a pro-inclusive green growth environment? I think that the answer is well, not so much. We're in a little bit of a crisis modality, careening from crisis to crisis. When the G20 meet in their newly self-appointed role as the quasi decision makers for and agenda setters for the world community, they are most often, certainly in the recent period, have been most often concerned with crisis management, and often in a very sectional way. So we need, if we're serious about these kinds of goals, much more of a intermediate and long-term view of the horizon of our actions and the effects of our actions, which can attend to what is required in order to create the suitable environment that I've just described. Okay, that is a little abstract as well. We can get into some more details about what might be needed or what might be helpful. Let me stop there. I think I've spoken for about half an hour, so that's more than enough. And of course, we can go into these issues in more detail. Matjaz, any thoughts on your side? I'll leave it to you. to take it from you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay, for your comprehensive and very deep thinking about the state of global system or non-system of development, and what are the normative reasons or explanations behind such a lack of system, normative, also institutional. You described also your interesting experience from ECOSOC as an independent advisor in trying to develop a more coherent approach toward developmental strategies in different regions around the world. But we see that there is still a lack of comprehensive, coherent approaches, or as you say, lack of coordination at the high level of participation of all the stakeholders at various levels. But there is one, I think you raised so many important issues, like who is in favor of maintaining the status quo, which is largely not working for the excluded parts of population, both in developing and developed countries, and many other important elements. You also pointed to some very interesting, maybe a little bit less sometimes mentioned positive examples or instances of successful international coordination in some areas, which shows the abilities or capacities of the international community to act when somehow pulled together. But I think in your presentation, in your analysis, there is one very important element that you have mentioned, and it really deserves more of our thinking and attention, which is backsliding. How is it possible that the international communities, despite these proclaimed goals, and as you said, imbalances between rhetoric and practice, is actually backsliding on its own commitments, and also the developments are actually not they are not going in the same I would say direction of the level of needs for the international community, and this is clearly visible to any independent objective observer at whatever level of developments, local, regional, national, or international. What is this backsliding? What does this say to all of us? What is the rationale behind this backsliding? And I would say my association would be there is going on something like a corrosion of character, which is a reference obviously to Richard Sennett. And I think we have our mindset. You mentioned the issue of solidarity and how would Martians perceive our solidarity, sometimes energetically expressed by social movements in developed and developing parts of the world. But essentially, if you look to the outcomes, to the content of this expressed or desired solidarity, we see that this solidarity is being developed at ever decreasing levels of practical effects. So, and I would say that this backsliding and this corrosion has a lot to do with this feeling of helplessness, or also internalizations of there are no alternatives. So it seems that we have somehow systematically, structurally internalized the idea that there is not much else to be done around the world, so that there is some kind of invisible hand, or where we should be trusting more international free flow capital, the activities of the multinational companies that are so powerful, so advanced, so technologically sophisticated that they are capable of solving all these issues, problems that are at hand, either climate change, production of high quality sustainable food production, for example, in all parts of the world, taking care of environment in more sustainable ways, and that basically they can also somehow include or incorporate all these parts of populations that are being deprived of resources, opportunities, and everything. So it is kind of this combination that leads to a stalemate. I would say lack of ideas, and also corrosion character increasingly. So, and there is also a fear, in so many parts of the developed parts of the world that if we try to, try to overcome this stalemate, institutional or structural, that this will be somehow at the expense of the interest of the middle class, well-off middle class in the developed countries. So I think this is some kind of a background explanation why is there such a lack of real energy, motivation to overcome something that you describe as a lack of coordinated approach toward issues of unresolved issues of development that are so visible, that are so near to all of us, and they affect, or they would affect us almost in a predictable ways. But we are not acting in countering or even trying to systematically approach these challenges and issues. And in some ways, we are even further. We are distancing ourselves further from this unused, unexploited possibilities for collective action. And how to and yeah, maybe these goals that you are correctly described as questionable on so many ways, and they're sometimes even misleading us into a sense that the world is progressing in the right direction, because so many of these data and numbers that we can get from the MDGs or SDGs, they are mainly thanks to the rise of China and the successes of the global pictures. They look much nicer because of China's ability to lift so many people out of absolute poverty in the last 3-4 decades, that the global pictures of inequalities and global extent of global poverty are, I think, more rosy than the actual situations. So, of course, there are successes in other large countries, as you are much more aware of and familiar with than all of us, like in India, efforts, Brazil. We have discussed this, but I think the overall picture, even at the end of the MDGs and the declaration of SDGs, was actually on a superficial level described as, I think, in a much more optimistic terms than the socioeconomic realities. And you're one of the scholars, one of the experts who have this very nuanced analysis of a real extent of inequalities, global poverty, global misery in so many parts of the world that we tend to forget, or we say, well, this is not in through our corroding character. Maybe it's not such a big importance to all of us, right? So I think this lack also of you talked about the self-enlightened interest is also somehow disappearing from the so many participants, so many actors, policymakers, technocrats. Also, although I'm sure that in all international organizations, as we discussed last week, and also in so many countries with still existing ministries for development and support, humanitarian aid, development aid, they're so strongly committed. But I think they are a minority. And the overall policies of the countries, bilateral or multilateral or international organizations, are much more technocratic, and they approach these real challenges for the entire humanity in a very technical ways, very superficial, without thinking much more on a normative level about the importance of empowerment, emancipation, inclusion, balanced developments. And this is, I think, these are the elements of backsliding at a very normative level. So this is not to deny successes, efforts in some aspects, but I think President of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn, sometimes was very open and clear about that. He said several times that these are only small drops in a bucket of misery and deprivation around the world, and generally, I think we are misleading ourselves that the current developments are going in the right direction. We just need to support them, to declare a few more goals, few more commitments, add maybe few tiny or less percentage points, and then basically this will solve the remaining unresolved problems of unequal, unequitable, imbalanced development around the world, and we are totally misleading ourselves. Why? Because maybe of lack of awareness, lack of interest. Also because we are also in being really pushed in recent cycles from crisis to crisis. Not all of the social segments are going through the same crisis. In fact, some of the privileged circles were very safe even in the period of financial crisis because of the huge supports of taxpayers' money. Now they were very safe also during the pandemic. So they are not affected in equal ways like other parts of the society, and other parts of the society like the essential workers also in the in the most developed countries that bear the brunt of pressures and crises and also consequences of pandemic. They are precarious workers, for example, very poorly treated even by the most developed countries themselves. So this corrosion of character and also unawareness that there is a strong backslide and overall developments are actually not going in the right direction from the perspective of world development system. Suppose there is some normative sense of what the world development system should look like, I think it's going actually at the expense of the majority of population and their interest in the first and in the third world. And as long as this is not sufficiently articulated, addressed, and accepted, it will be very difficult to reach some kind of a structural change in this approach toward more coherent levels that can be developed at the conceptual and normative levels, certainly not with the same kind of approach, but the approach that you described in the ECOSOC or your UNDP period of being advisor. And there are so many, I think, possibilities to start mapping more coherent, more elaborated, also alternative approaches that would actually work for the excluded population. But this would require, I would say, an overall different structural setting than the current context of really prevailing neoliberal financial global capitalism, which really creates this sense that this is the pattern of development that cannot be restructured, reorganized. But we, this is kind of a really act of surrender, intellectual, moral, and practical, from so many maybe also experts, independent social groups, also lack of much more open and pluralistic public discourse within the academia and also in broader public terms about the alternative possibilities that are actually being constantly pushed on the margin. Just one example, and then I will stop here. You mentioned the positive success, the success story of the Montreal Protocol or the improvements of petrol, right? Without lead. I think this shows some positive instances. Maybe even the recent global agreement on minimum corporate tax base around the world can be potentially a step in the right direction, provided that there will be more support for the tax administration in the developing countries. Otherwise, they will not be able to raise sufficient money. So this money will, again, these revenues will not go to the developing countries, but maybe they will end up in the developed countries, or maybe somehow miraculously then end up in some beautiful islands around the world again. So there are so many cycles of how to bypass, how to subvert even the most positive efforts. But there is a production in the mid 20th century, even during the World War II, there was a much more successful health initiative, which was global production of penicillin, for example, and distribution and access. Without, can you imagine that 78 years ago, the world was much more capable of satisfying and disseminating and sharing such an important global good such as access to penicillin, its production, the formula, distribution, access, then 70, 80 years later, with this huge technological advancement, with huge multinational companies, their support by the governments, we see, you know, it is more difficult today to distribute, to provide access, so vital access, which would be in clear interest of the entire humanity, to produce, to distribute more equally, more equitably, at a much faster pace. I'm sure if there was any such thing as a global collective action addressing this problem, the approach, the solutions, the whole variety of activities would have looked completely differently. And you are completely right. If this is a prelude to the way how in the next coming weeks the international community will approach the global climate change, I think this is a very bad prelude and not a very promising sign. And I think this should not be now as a recognition of like pessimistic conclusions, but rather a call, like intellectual academic call for rethinking the overall approach toward I think what you really call correctly the missing basically global development system, which must be developed in a pluralistic manner. It can be pluralistic in such a way to adjust, right? You talked about different regional issues and different reasons for the extent of poverty, absolute poverty in different parts of the world, but we would really need to have a really much more enlightened approach, and we would see the difference. Now we know that this is not a very sufficiently, not far from it, enlightened approach to so many vital challenges that are affecting all of us, and they will continue to affect all of us at the detriment of so much misery and so many deprivation, which is unnecessary and we shouldn't be, as intellectuals, as philosophers of humanity, we should not treat this as something new normal or completely acceptable. We should do much better than this.
Matjaz, thank you so much. Is it possible for me to share my screen just briefly?
Absolutely.
I think I could try to do that. I wanted to just show you a graph. I see it's not possible yet, but when it's possible, I'll do that.
Yes.
In any case, let me just say, while waiting
to
do that, that you made a number of very important and significant points. I wanted, which I'd like to just briefly respond to, but I wanted to show you all, if I could, this picture, which I just pulled up using the magic of the internet, from the OECD Development Assistance Committee, which tracks the ODA flows of the members of the OECD and now also non-members. It also attempts to track them. This is a picture of, I believe, OECD only data, OECD countries' outward flows of ODA. And you can see in this graph, which runs only to 2015, because I couldn't find the most recent one easily in the last few minutes, but you can find both the absolute and the relative to gross national income flows. The flows relative to gross national income are given by the dashed line, and you can see this is precisely backsliding, the backsliding we were talking about, and which Matjaz just referred to, that the ODI per GNI has gone down, actually, from what appeared to have been, of course, from a smaller number of major donors at that time, somewhere on the order of 0.5% of gross national income, to the current 0.3. And I did check the latest figures after I mentioned them in my introductory remarks, and the latest figures are 0.30 for, I think, 2019, which is down by 0.01 from the previous year. So there's been no change between 2015 and now, essentially. It's been stagnant, plateauing at 0.30, despite all the bombastic rhetoric about global development goals and the SDGs and our shared commitment to them. Not the tiniest movement. And we know that there are countries such as the UK, which had considerably raised its ODA to GNI share to meet and I think briefly also exceed its the 0.7 level, if I recall correctly, which have now considerably reduced their ODA flows. So you can also see this and see that backtracking on a different time scale in individual countries. Now, the total absolute value of the flows has increased because the global economy has been growing, right? But if the measure of effort is the percentage of GNI, then it has been stagnant. And I'm not one of those who believes that aid flows by themselves are transformative, but nevertheless, it is an index of effort. And I think that that's the reason to look at this particular graph. Okay. So just briefly, and I don't want to go on at length because I think it will be interesting to hear from students as well. I just wanted to respond, Matjaz, to a few things you said. I think you made a hugely important point in referring to the corrosion of character. I'm not usually prone to psychologistic explanations, but of course it was a metaphor. And you were trying to capture here quite a number of the things that have happened in societies. For example, it occurs to me that the rise of xenophobic nationalism in many, many countries around the world, in your region of the world, in the region of the world I live in, and the region of the world I'm from, and the region of the world other parts of your student body, no doubt, are connected to regions, is notable, right? And this has been at odds with the pursuit of the kind of cooperative solutions which we have in mind, presumably. And so there's a ironic aspect to this, that in the very moment when we most need global cooperative solutions, when in a sense, at least for some of these questions, such as climate change, it's our last chance, we have a kind of a separatist, neo-isolationist modality that has emerged, right? But I think rather than pointing fingers, deriding, or hand-wringing about that, what we really need to do as lawyers, political economists, and institutional scholars and actors is to think about what would be the format, the structure or the design of an institutional order that would work in a contrary direction. I don't know if you recall, Matjaz, the phrase that Chuck Sable and some of his co-authors introduced of ratcheting up in institutions. Right? So the idea was that there are norms which one wishes to promote, and one would like to put in place institutional mechanisms which encourage the individual countries or actors to raise their level of effort or to improve the quality of their actions so as to be more in accordance with or come closer to the norms or the goals which are being promoted, right? And if one has this intention of ratcheting up in an institutional system, where of course the metaphor of ratcheting up involves the idea that once you go up, it's hard to go down, harder to go down than it is to go up, then I think one has to think in a very specific way about the particular institutional mechanisms which help to bring that about, right? And that's not just a rhetoric, a shared rhetoric of adoption of global goals, for instance, but it's mechanisms which can spotlight where action is needed, provide technical or other assistance for bringing about those actions, and involve an ongoing process of interaction to move in the right direction, Right? And this is why I argued for, and this is just an example here, but I argued for, in the global context, what I referred to as a mechanism of peer and partner review, which would have that feature of spotlighting what countries need to do through the involvement of their peers and partners, countries which are similarly situated and countries which are differently situated, civil society actors, relevant scholars and students of policies, and so through a periodic process which would encourage countries to move in particular directions. Now, there is a mechanism for countries to self-report about their progress under the SDGs, but it's an extremely weak mechanism because it doesn't include the kind of spotlighting and action orientation which I've just described, in which there would be a identification of gaps, but more than that, detailed discussion and even prescription of particular possibilities for diminishing those gaps, without also taking the view that countries are always at fault for the gaps that they have, recognizing that there are regional and global dimensions to this, which also have to be similarly addressed. And of course, crucially, doing an adding up, looking at the question of what is the sum total of the actions which countries are undertaking and whether those are adequate for what is needed collectively. And where they are not, doing a similar kind of spotlighting and action-oriented prescription on a periodic basis. This, by the way, is vaguely reminiscent of what Chuck Sable had in mind, I think, by ratcheting up when he was referring to the OECD's mechanisms for coordination. I think they were called the Open Method of Coordination, OMC, which he discussed, but also other such mechanisms that are adopted within networks of firms to bring in industry standards and so on. Now, without becoming too fetishistic about which specific methodology should be applied, I think the point is that one needs to think institutionally, right, about what are the mechanisms for ratcheting up. And if one does that, right, not thinking in terms of, I think, sticks, but more in terms of carrots, encouragement and facilitation, as Christian Barry and I argued in our book on international trade and labor standards, for example, then I think one can imagine ways in which the current mood of neo-isolationism and the associated corrosion of character, as you rightly described it, can be combated. And of course, all of this is subtended by, made possible by the rejection of TINA, the idea that there is an alternative, not that there is no alternative, but that for us to arrive at that alternative requires for us to be imaginative about institutions at each and every level, global, regional, national, and how they can fit together. There have been periods of immense inventiveness in international institutions and orders, as you know, and there have been periods of stasis and stagnation. And I think that the need today is to reawaken some of the inventiveness which had been previously present in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, as you noted, of course, under a different dispensation, which may have made that much more possible. I thought the example of penicillin that you gave was wonderful, and I would like to learn more about that. As you say, it's urgently relevant to our current situation, and we really ought to highlight the contrast between these, what was done then and what could be done now as a result of our enlightened self-interest.
Great, thank you also for your response. So I suggest we give a floor to our students for their interventions, comments, questions maybe. Don't be too afraid. I know that we are giving you a lot of food for thought, a lot of normative points of departure, a lot of institutional analysis and empirical examples, but there are so many issues on the table, so don't be afraid to start from whatever point you see interesting, important, also from your perspective. of a new generation, which is going to face all these challenges that we are currently producing and reproducing at the ever faster pace. So how do you see these obstacles or possibilities for overcoming? We are not here to inject more pessimistic mood into your studies, but on the contrary, we are here to encourage more creative, innovative thinking, much along the lines of like Sanjay's thinking, and also references. Charles Sables would be certainly one of them. Also frequently mentioned Roberto Unger, how to avoid how to act programmatically and coherently in the absence of crisis, instead of waiting for the crisis to push us to our next level of development. So yes, please.
Well, hello. First of all, thank you very much for this discussion. I think it's a little bit hard for ourselves to express ourselves after such quality discussion. I was wondering something about what options do we have to force states to invest themselves in such invest themselves in institutions and organizations to be a little bit more coordinative and to work together in issues of development, because since states remain the main actors of the international system, we cannot plan anything without them and their consent, even through institutions. So my question is, what are the options to force states to engage somewhere they don't have such interest or views?
Yes, great. Thank you very much for your question, Julian. We'll be glad to discuss this further. It's a very important question. So maybe we'll collect a few more questions or your interventions. We receive also some questions via chat, which is also great. So we'll try to also answer some of the questions there from chat. But if you have some of your interventions, please. Vanya, yes, please.
Hi. So first of all, thank you very much for the great discussion that you initiated. I wanted to go into a little more, let's say, regional aspect. So since I come from Southeastern European studies at the University of Graz, I'm very much got struck, or it is peculiar for me that you consider global actors to be a source right now, considering that in the last 2 decades, the focus was shifting more towards regional studies and regional cooperation. So my question here would be, what are, with your impression, of course, obstacles and possibilities? One thing as an example that I could mention here is the CEFTA trade agreement, which notably helped Central European countries during their EU accession process, but nowadays it has nothing to do with Central Europe anymore. It is only on paper Central European Free Trade Agreement, but it's considering Southeastern Europe right now. And it is also not fulfilling the successes that they had in expectations, given the success that they had in the late 90s and the early 2000s with that region. So thanks.
Thank you, Vanya. So now we have questions from Julian, from Vanya. Anyone? So we got some comments in our chat. So are there any more questions at this stage? Maybe Sanjay, you would like to respond to some of the questions?
Sure, Matjaz. They're both very good questions that were asked, and I see a couple of things in the chat which perhaps I could try to speak to as well. But briefly, and I'd love to hear your view about these matters. So first, Julian, Julian asked, what are, if I understood it, and please correct me if this is not your question, what are the ways in which we can get countries to be more involved in promoting desirable actions or undertaking desirable actions that affect other countries that are distant from them, and perhaps not in their own regions, and perhaps not in ways which directly benefit them or seem to benefit them. Is that the question, Julian?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think that this is a very important question, of course. We see in practice, in terms of the international aid business, for instance, that there's a practice of countries doing what's called planting their flags elsewhere. The donor countries tend to have very fragmented and distributed aid programs. So, for instance, whereas the former colonial powers historically had larger aid programs in their former colonies, over time, they too have distributed their aid programs much more widely, so that they've planted their flag everywhere. And you also have countries that are not really explicitly, at least, former colonial powers. Let's say, Switzerland, for instance, and its aid program would also be one which, or countries like Switzerland would also have aid programs which have this feature, where there's a degree of fragmentation and distribution. You would find activities in Latin America, activities in Africa, activities in South Asia, and so on and so forth, right? So in practice, countries are doing something which seems to show a degree of recognition or awareness that there is some benefit to them, some value, maybe, if we don't want to use a narrow word such as benefit, some value in making efforts to improve conditions in those far-flung countries. To paraphrase famously Neville Chamberlain with respect to Czechoslovakia, you'll recall, he when he came back to the UK, there was a reference to at the eve of the Second World War, a country far away about which we know little. Well, these may be countries far away about which we know little, and yet there is some impulse to show that we are helping. That having been said, the aspect of rhetoric, packaging, superficiality is very considerable, right? Because planting your flag is not the same thing as doing something sizable. So the question that then arises is, how do we encourage something more meaningful and substantial? And I think that's where the institutional architecture of ratcheting up comes in, right? That, for instance, to use a slightly vulgar phrase, you have to pay to play, right? If you want to be involved at all in the system of international cooperation, then you also have to contribute to the public goods. This discussion came up in the United Nations development, in regard to the United Nations development system, because it turned out that some of the, most of the activities on the ground of the United Nations as a whole had no funding, zero funding. So in particular, the resident coordinator, what has come to be called the resident coordinator, formerly the resident representative of the UN, who is supposed to shepherd all of the sheep in the form of the individual UN entities located in a given country, and to cause them to act in a coordinated fashion as one UN, what they called one UN, didn't have a fund even to provide for coffee for a meeting for these people to come together, the representatives of the different entities or organizations, okay, let alone anything more substantial. So it was a purely symbolic function with no real backing. Okay? And one of the discussions which took place, therefore, is how can one create some funding, and in particular, can one in some sense tax the donors who want to contribute to individual organizations without contributing to the common or shared functions. To say to them, look, you have to contribute to the common and shared functions if you're going to contribute to the individual organizations, at least a little bit, right? So the institutional architecture has to accommodate that, or indeed demand that, in order for this gap to be diminished. So I think that kind of thinking more generally as to what one can and should expect of the actors by way of support for common functions and common purposes, the global public goods which have to be provided, for instance, which are various in nature. Addressing climate change is, of course, one of them, but also to ensure that enough effort is being undertaken, right, in places where maybe it's not glamorous to undertake those efforts, or where, as you say, the individual donor countries may not see an interest directly in doing so. Right? I think that's precisely where certainly entities such as the United Nations have a larger role to play than they have done, but also there is a need for an institutional architecture that is precisely focused upon that. Okay. And Vanya asked about regional agreements and global agreements. I think the example that you gave, well, actually, in a way, it wasn't really about the regional and the global. It was about the sub-regional and the regional, wasn't it? Because you were talking about how the initial efforts at creating a free trade or a freer trade area in Southeast and Central Europe ended up being really about EU accession, or facilitating EU accession. Well, I think this is an illustration of how contextual it is, what kinds of cooperation prove to be attractive to countries and eventually become dominant. We talked a little bit in the last class about how during the 90s, there was a bit more of a contest in Eastern and Central Europe regarding what model would be eventually applied, what model of social policy, what model of economic policy. And the center of gravity or attraction, which is the EU, proved to be quite strong enough that it overcame some of the more Wild West free market US-centric ideas as to what type of economic and social system should be adopted, right, in these countries. And arguably that was a good thing, because it's facilitated at least a degree of a social democratic compromise, even if that came more from without than from within, because of the existing pattern of EU institutions and norms. So it's a limited demand, but nevertheless, it is a demand for a degree of a social market economy, right, to have been introduced. So I think these determinations of which direction a country will go always have a political economy element which is deeply contextual and very much shaped by the centers of gravity or attraction which it finds to be closer to it. But certainly I think we have today a situation where the global layer has become increasingly thin. The regional layer is also challenged in some ways, as we see in the current debates. All of you, I'm sure, are following the debate on Poland in the European Union very closely. So even the regional is being rather challenged. And so what we're left with really is not just a non-system, but the collapse of many of the forms of coordination that did exist. And I think it's against that that one has to push. But of course, this is not just a matter of intellect or will, it's a matter of political contexts. And so that work is is slow and has to also wait for the relevant openings to emerge. Maybe I'll stop there, Matjaz, for you to maybe comment on these, and I'll meanwhile look at the issues that have come up in the chat window.
That's right. Yes, I suggest we take care of both. And maybe before I answer or provide some additional comments, are there any other questions at this point of our discussion? Please just jump in. Because Sanjay talked about this very important international need for more elaborated institutional architecture to create more inclusive, more balanced international and global developments, including providing public goods, including raising global standards in labor protection and environment protection, as Sanjay has been written extensively for many years now in very elaborated proposals. So we see there are very credible, very elaborated possibilities of normative and practical value, how to improve or strengthen the institution in the international institutional architecture. But there are also there is one additional, I would say, deficiency or constraint of the international institutional architecture, which is there is a very constraining, very limited policy space for initiatives bottom up to activate the local populations to exploit their potential and their comparative advantages in different parts of the world. So in this sense, the existing framework of trade regime, of investment regime, of financial regime is very constraining. It limits the policy space, regulatory autonomy, and the possibilities for initiatives that would emerge bottom up, that would lead to a more decentralized initiative, efforts, and developments. So I think Julian really put a very, very important questions at the international, global levels of need of improving, of creating more coherent institutional international architecture. But at the same time, this requires also a restructuring, also bottom up, not only top down approaches. That would create, that would open more policy space, that would create, that would give to local communities, regions, more instruments, more tools to develop their own strategies, to explore, to implement and fulfill their own productive and creative potential. And this requires participation. This requires inclusion of all the citizens at local and regional levels that are now completely somehow excluded or disempowered. And they cannot participate in this process of knowledge-based economy. So this is a call and also suggestion. I think Julian correctly asked how to develop new institutions, innovative institutions at local and regional levels that would be more inclusive, more participatory, and more experimental from the institutions that we have today, that are highly limited and they don't pull together all the ideas, initiatives, and also possibilities to create developmental strategies that would be articulated by the citizens themselves, by groups of experts, by civil society, by local entrepreneurs, by local agricultural producers in different environments. So this is a very constraining institutional architecture that we are dealing with, which is, and the policy space is constantly shrinking, which actually leads to a very hierarchical institutional development worldwide. So this will be a reversal of institutional constraints. And I think this is very much in line also with Charles Sable's teaching of learning by monitoring. These institutions should be experimental, like the institutions that Charles Sable has studied himself, like local public-private partnerships in Ireland were vehicles of successful development in Ireland in the 1990s. In the rural areas of Ireland, there were so many pilot projects, very experimental in its nature with the support of the central government, but especially they were developed by the local population themselves. So national bankers, national government officials, they went to all other different regional areas that they took and to discuss the possibilities or developmental opportunities that were that the local population saw in their own areas. With also they talked to the unemployed people, to the people with different ideas, different potentials that were usually they are not included in any kind of ideas or initiatives. How to restructure, how to improve possibilities for more decentralized, more inclusive, and higher value development. So this is why we need new institutional thinking, ideas, and also this process of learning by monitoring, as Charles Sable has put forward so many times, also in his context of OMC approach, which is also learning process. You go to different areas that may be successfully restructured, you learn from their experience, but then you go back to your context and you try to somehow adjust to your own potential needs and possibilities, and maybe you develop different kind of institutional setting, financial support, support for dissemination of technologies and all other necessary resources, including I saw that Vladimir was talking about the need to improve education at all stages of individual lives, right? So these are some of the institutional possibilities in now very constrained and limited scope that we are all of us are facing, and it leads to disempowerment, sense of helplessness that I described earlier. And similar question answer could be also given. I completely agree with Sanjay's a little bit more cautious approach with this CEFTA agreement, because this can be like kind of a poor substitute for proper enlargement process for the countries that now, for various reasons that are not only on the side of the prospective EU member states, but mainly on the sides of institutional limitations and problems, as Sanjay has mentioned, with the current institutional decision-making processes within the European Union. So I would say that these regional agreements, I think the problem, as I see it, is rather they're also very hierarchical. I think they lead to kind of this core, semi-periphery, periphery hierarchical divisions. I don't see institutions there in these regional agreements that would be more innovative, that would have institutions to disseminate know-how. Now the knowledge economy requires a much more skilled working force, much more skilled entrepreneurial approaches. It requires access to new technologies and constant also support for permanent innovations in the production in order to climb the ladder of industrial development instead of being permanently arrested at some lower levels of development, and just provide ready-made standardized supply parts basically for the core countries that are hugely productive, successful in their export orientation. So we see this, I think this also leads kind of a regional strong hierarchical segmentations that also create a lot of discontent and backlash. And I don't think this is the best possible model of development. And I think it is not even consistent with the idea of Chuck Sable's OMC approach, which is based on constant learning, improvements, experiments, advancement, not just being very successful in producing a huge volumes of standardized products that are basically determined and designed and ordered by the leading multinational companies in Europe, which are obviously flooding markets then around the world, right? At their own benefits mainly, and tiny benefits for the region, which is I think leading to huge potential future conflicts on so many levels.
So Matjaz, sorry, is there another question?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for answering so generously to my question.
Matjaz, maybe I could just comment on one or two of the things that you've said. So I just wanted to agree that we really need to think dynamically and not just statically, right? And the entire logic of free trade agreements, as propounded by mainstream economists, has been static. It's about static efficiencies. And it's not about the question of how countries will move up the ladder and what kinds of arrangements will enable them to do that. It's also not about what kinds of order will facilitate innovation in institutions. As you pointed out, there's so many domains of life where there's bottom-up innovation that has been observed and is possible, right? And we may want to encourage that, going beyond trade to various kinds of issue areas and domains in which there are now confining institutional orders, which actually preclude or prohibit the kinds of innovation which we may want to encourage. Right? The Hippocratic Oath's prescription, first do no harm, is violated by many of these arrangements because they make it impossible to undertake certain kinds of experimentation and innovation. I think, for instance, about such things as cooperatives and the scope for national regulation and also policies of encouragement for cooperative movements, which is limited by some of the restrictions which we have on subsidies, for instance, or on other elements. And I think having some more degrees of freedom which are made available in the rule system for the constituent entities is crucial in order to facilitate this kind of innovation. You might remember that Danny Roderick wrote a paper which was called, if I remember correctly, Trade as if Development Mattered. But if we were going to take that seriously, trade as if development mattered, then one of the things we would want to do, and of course, every other aspect of the international order, is as if development mattered, as if inclusive development mattered. One of the things we'd want to do is to take this dynamic rather than static approach toward encouraging and enhancing innovation. So participation and innovation are both connected deeply, as you point out, in this bottom-up perspective. I also wanted to just briefly again return to the question of the sub-regional and the regional, the countries that have acceded to the European Union in your region have another kind of a battle potentially to fight, have another set of questions potentially to raise, having done that, right? The scope for innovation is no longer in a sub-regional agreement or an alternative agreement for trade, but it's in making their voice more fully expressed for a different kind of institutional order at the European level, right? Which might be, for instance, more permissive in certain domains, or which might be more progressive in certain domains. That may well require also a pan-European movement of those who are concerned with these possibilities, as Yanis Varoufakis has argued in a different context. Whether or not that's politically likely to succeed in current conditions without a great deal of legwork is a different question. I suspect that the time is not yet for that, but the groundwork nevertheless has to be laid.
Great. Before we are slowly coming to a conclusion of today's lecture, is there any last comment, question from our students that should be addressed today?
I do see a couple of things in the chat which I can speak about briefly.
Please do.
Should I now, or?
Please.
Okay. So first of all, Vladimir has said that he is a realist, and he believes that most people are self-centered, and that to get voters in developed countries to take concerns of the rest of the world more seriously requires education, and he wonders whether that means different kinds of educational initiatives, such as, for instance, he says, teaching international political economy in high schools rather than waiting until university education, and so on. And he asks, what are the best approaches to deal with such public education? Well, I think that it's perfectly right that one has to appeal to people's own sense of well-being. And this is one of the reasons that I do emphasize increasingly when I think and talk about development questions, that most of the big global questions, which are also questions which directly, at least potentially directly affect the well-being of the developed country voters and populations, have a development aspect to them, if they are not centrally development questions. And so, again, to return to the theme of enlightened self-interest, taking a intermediate and long-term view of what will further one's own economic security and social well-being in the developed countries requires attention to these questions. And that is because they do have a public good aspect, and because there are profound interdependencies involved. So it's not really a question of getting people to act more altruistically. I know that that's been a large part of the framing of development appeals in the past, right? In the 1980s, for instance, we had Band-Aid and other such moments where the notion was that out of the goodness of their hearts, people in the developed world would address the concerns of people in the developing world. That's still very much a dominant discourse, at least a prominent discourse, but I would rather shift the attention now to the interdependence and the aspect of public goods. In the last class, we talked about some of those. I mentioned that, of course, it's true of climate change, but it's also true of a number of other issues, including global financial stability and inclusive economic conditions in countries that sustain employment for the vast majority and stable livelihoods. And it's also true of migration and its orderly regulation and so forth. These are issues which are close to the concerns of voters in the developed countries, but one has to make the case that there are these interdependencies, right? So for instance, today there's the question, is China the friend and the savior, or is China the enemy in a number of the developed countries? That's the way the problem is being framed. The problem is not being framed as it should be framed in terms of interdependence, which requires a cooperative arrangement that can sustain not only peace and security as conventionally understood, but economic and social security and well-being for the vast majority of the world's people, which requires confronting that interdependence, right? Climate change is not going to be addressed adequately if the largest emitters today were not the largest historical emitters necessarily, but the largest emitters today of carbon gases and the like are carbon and greenhouse gases are not on board, right, with the solution. Mm-hmm. And that involves dealing with their development aspirations, not just dismissing their development aspirations, because then they will not cooperate, but recognizing and addressing their development aspirations in some manner in one's own self-interest, so that the ice caps in the Alps don't melt. And maybe some people don't mind if the ice caps melt, but it's a different issue. But if you mind, then, and you're in Slovenia or in Austria or in Switzerland, then maybe you ought to be concerned about whether India or China or Brazil or Nigeria or whoever else are going to be on board. Right. So this is not an issue of altruism, it's an issue of enlightened self-interest, which is a topic, by the way, and Matjaz, this is something we can go back to another time, but which is remarkably little discussed in social science. There are some, sometimes people wave in that direction, but really there's very little analytical discussion of what that concept might mean and why it might be justified. Instead, all the discussion is about the prisoner's dilemma and the supposed free existence of a free rider problem and the supposed irrationality of cooperation. So it's a fascinating imbalance. Okay, so let me now briefly also speak to the other question in the chat, which was by, please tell me how to pronounce it, Jan?
Jan, yes, very good.
Jan, okay. So Jan says there is a rationality of conflict. He says that I talked about there being a rationality of conflict and also a rationality of cooperation, which is less perceived but still possible. And he says, if we stay within this framework, wouldn't you say that the powerful actors are then rationally choosing not to promote systemic changes and maintaining the status quo? In other words, rationally not choosing to cooperate effectively. Well, I think I wouldn't say that. And the reason is because, as I mentioned at the outset, the Martian or the external observer would say, I think, that we do have a deficit in the realized level of cooperation with respect to these important global problems, and a deficit in a strict analytical sense, which is that the outcomes for all are going to be worse, or for almost all, at least, are going to be worse in the absence of cooperation than in the presence of cooperation, and that's true in a number of these instances, right? So again, I'll direct you to the relevant essays by Amartya Sen and others on cooperative competition. I'm sorry, I meant to say cooperative conflict. Cooperative competition is another term in social science that's related, but very different. Cooperative conflict. If you look at that literature, what you'll see is the idea that there is a, using economist language, a Pareto frontier, right? One wants to be on the Pareto frontier, as opposed to inside the Pareto frontier. In other words, one wants to ensure that it is that one has done what one can to generate the fruits of cooperation in order that everyone can be better off, where it is possible for everyone to be better off. That having been said, of course, the Pareto frontier consists of many different distributions of well-being. And there are efficient solutions which benefit some more than others, and vice versa. So for instance, to go back to my example about washing the dishes, the inefficient solution is that you pile up all the dishes in the sink so that none are available when you have to have your next meal, right? That's not desirable. It would be better that somebody do the dishes. But then there's a question, will it be one person or another person or both? Maybe they will work out a arrangement where they alternate or something else of that nature. So one would like to avoid the inefficiency, but that doesn't eliminate the conflict among cooperative solutions, right? And I think where we are in the world is we're inside the frontier, and that's not a place to be. We want to place we want to be. We want to at least ensure that we have the benefits of cooperation, and we shouldn't let the best be the enemy of the good, right? Of course, there must be a fair distribution of the benefits of cooperation to ensure that there is cooperation at all, because human beings being who we are, we tend to be less inclined to cooperation when we think that there's an unfair distribution of benefits, as behavioral economists and psychologists have studied, right? So we would want to ensure that, if at all possible, in order to have a meaningful mechanism of implementation, as much as because fairness is a value in and of itself. Right?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sanjay. Because we are slowly coming to an end, unless there is any pressing comment or reaction from the students, I would like to really thank Sanjay for your two excellent contributions, lessons, very thoughtful analysis that will encourage all of us to think more deeper about the need how to establish properly a workable world development system sometime in the near future as a part of our collective effort and commitment to improvements, structural improvements from around the world. So I really deeply thank you on behalf of our faculty, of the students, and wish you all the best. Thank you, and we stay in touch.
It was a pleasure to be here, Matjaz, and meet your students and chat, and you and I will have to continue our discussion at greater length soon. This was a great pleasure.